Hey everyone, Kelvin here. Welcome back to another knowledge transfer with myself. And today is going to be a little bit different because it's not going to be your usual tech knowledge transfer. It's going to be more related to, it's going to be more informational, is one way of putting it. And that's because what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about how to create your own powerful virtual lab environment for under $2,000. Now, in the UK, that's equivalent to approximately £1,500. I have a lot of people reach out to me and ask me what I use to lab and the specs of my machines. So I thought it'd be worth putting this video together to give those that are really serious about taking that next step in the IT certification journey, or those that are really serious about learning more about the technologies that they're working with, a way to actually get a lab put together without having to rely on paying for someone else's lab, or without having to rely on only being able to access a lab, let's say when you're at work. So with that being said, let's kick straight off. I'm hoping that this is going to be an interesting session for many of you out there. I mean, it's definitely something that I wanted to know when I was first starting out, and now that I've been through that and I've had that journey, I can now share this with you. So everything in this presentation today is based off of my thoughts and what I have been through, my experiences to getting my own virtual lab environment. So just before we discuss the benefits that you can see on screen already, I just wanted to talk about, I wanted to talk a little bit about how my journey has gone in terms of getting a lab environment. So for me, I was really serious about wanting to learn the technologies that I work with. I was really serious about wanting to excel my career and my certification journey. So have an environment that I could just use whenever I wanted to without having to rely on anybody else. Now, of course, with that, there's certain things you need to take into consideration, and we're going to start to discuss those today. So I have a virtual lab environment. You'll see a little bit more of that later on in this presentation. But for now, let's start with the benefits, or at least some of the benefits of having your own lab environment. So I've put some points up here, as you can see, and we're just going to go through these one by one and maybe elaborate on these a little bit more. So the first one is reduced expenditure paying for lab time. So I definitely see this as one benefit because, we all know there's many different environments out there that you can access or pay for so that you can lab. The only problem with that sometimes is you are on a subscription, or it is time-based, so that once your credits run out you need to pay again, or likewise when the subscription runs out you also need to pay again to continue to use that particular service. Of course, there is free virtual environments or emulators or simulators out there, but you're running them on your own machine. So with that comes the cost of CPU, RAM, storage, all that good stuff. So we're going to talk about that as well later on. So by reduced expenditure paying for lab time, what I mean is that once you've got your own lab environment, hopefully you can start to drive down those costs in what you're paying for subscribing to other lab environments. The second one is access to your virtual environment whenever you want. So there's nothing better than just being able to wake up in the morning and access your lab environment, or if you're working from home or even remotely and you've got remote access to your home environment, just being able to access your own environment and to recreate a problem that you might be facing, or to test out a new feature on a product. It's just brilliant being able to do that. And you can do that whenever you want, however you want, with no rules that govern how you should do that or the times that you have access to your virtual environment, because it's yours. So I really find that a great benefit to myself, not having to rely on anybody else. And then with that, you are the administrator. Nobody can tell you what to do in your own lab environment. You're not restricted to what you can access. You're not restricted, as I say, with time. So you are the admin. You create your own rules, and that is just brilliant. You also, I feel, another benefit is the ability to integrate virtual environments into your own network. So what I mean by this is, yes, you may purchase a server to create your virtual environment, but you also have the option, once you've done that, to integrate that into your home network. So you could maybe put a firewall on the edge of your network so that all traffic that runs through your home network has to go through a firewall. Or you might decide to hook your lab environment, your virtual lab environment, up to your physical lab environment, if you have one, or your physical home network. And for me, this is a massive benefit, because you get to play around with the technologies that you're learning, and it's in a live environment technically, so you've got traffic passing through that. So although your missus or your mister, your hubby, may get a little bit annoyed if you're breaking things, it's always good, because you get that real life experience. Maybe not so much as what you would in an office environment or a large corporate environment, but at the end of the day, you still have that traffic passing through your environment, so you have the ability to mess about with routers, switches, firewalls, things like that. And I think that's great. If you're already in the field, you will find oftentimes you run into an issue that you may know the technology, but you just don't understand why that technology is behaving in that particular way. So for me, having a lab to recreate customer environments on a much smaller scale, of course, sometimes is awesome, because I can then troubleshoot in my own environment without having to access or cause more problems on the customer environment. Hopefully you're not the one causing the problems, and you can really dig deep and understand what is going on before going back to your customer and hopefully presenting them with a solution. So that is a real benefit for anyone. And if I was to sell you a virtual lab now, that's probably one of the key benefits I would point out for those that are already working in the field. Another benefit is you also have the ability to have your virtual lab environment within another virtual lab environment. So what do I mean by that? Well, basically, you can create your virtual lab environment on an ESXi host, and within that you've got your virtual environment. And then what you can also do is you can use virtual simulators or emulators such as GNS3 or EVE-NG or even Cisco Viral, and you can load that image or that virtual environment onto your ESXi server and run a totally separate nested virtual environment. So what you could actually do is you could have a virtual lab environment that is a more permanent solution. It's not really build up, tear down. And then what you could have within your nested virtual environment is you could have Viral or EVE-NG or one of those programs out there running as well for times where it's more build up and tear down, quick labs and things like that. And this is exactly what I do, and I'll show you this later on in this presentation. The other benefit, which I'm sure nearly everybody or everybody should agree with me, is the benefit of labbing what you learn. So you can go through certification books, you can read certification books online or white papers, but sometimes it just doesn't stick until you actually lab what you're learning. And I've found this many a times where I will read something and I still don't quite understand it even after I've read it. And having the ability to be able to spin up a lab and lab what I'm learning gives me the ability to further understand what exactly I was learning in that book or on that particular topic. So for me, this is a real benefit, and I'm sure everybody out there that is working towards any certification has been in this position before, and as soon as they've labbed it, they've understood it a lot more than what they would have done by just reading it. So that is definitely a key benefit. And then the last one, I mean, of course there is more than this, but for me these are my personal benefits that I believe are the key ones, which is why I'm sharing them with you. So the last one is the ability to add more resources. So by that I mean you've gone out and you've bought your virtual server or your virtual PC, desktop PC, and you have the ability to you have the ability to add more RAM, you have the ability to add more CPU, you have the ability to add more storage. Because when you start to run these virtual environments, you start to use up a lot of resources, and depending on the sort of images and software you are using, you will quickly notice your resources are getting used up. So with a virtual lab environment, you have the ability to add, typically depending on the system you get, you have the ability to add more RAM and definitely storage to increase the number of hosts or nodes, whatever you want to call them, are running. Okay. And of course, when there's benefits, there's always drawbacks. And to be quite fair, I've not really noticed a lot of drawbacks. And this is the reason why there's only 4 bullet points on this particular slide. But I thought they'd be worth calling out just to kind of have them at top of mind for yourself before you just think it's okay just to go out and buy a big massive server and start labbing. So of course, with having your own virtual environment and your own virtual server, you have the potential to increase your electricity bill. So depending on the power output of your system, you will probably notice an increase in your electricity bill. And also, if your server is on constantly, you will also use more electricity. Another drawback is that it could be loud. Depending on what server you get, and probably getting a server for about $2,000 or just less is probably going to be fairly loud, especially when you are nearly maxing out all the resources and full on with your labbing. So you need to take that into consideration, especially if you haven't got your own space to lab. So for instance, myself at the minute, my server is in the living room and my missus hates it. So fortunate enough for us, we've just purchased a new house, so we will have my own separate study room coming soon, so she's going to love that because she's not going to hear it. But yeah, besides the point, do take that into consideration because when they get loud, they do get loud. Another drawback is that, there's a cost involved here. So if you're trying to get a decent server to lab quite a lot of things, you're probably going to be paying a large upfront cost. So $2,000 on a single purchase is, a large upfront cost. And regardless of any way you look at it, it's going to have to be an investment if you're looking at purchasing a server. But if you look at it as an investment and then you go out there and off the back of your virtual environment, you've been able to learn a lot more and get 3 more certifications and a pay rise, then to me that's justified. And the last one is additional space. And by additional space, I mean physical space. So these servers tend to be quite big, depending on what you get. You can get rack servers, which are 1U, 2U, etc. Or you can get tower servers. Myself, I prefer having a tower server. The only downside with the tower server, if you imagine a 1U server and the length of that server, not necessarily the width but the length, you imagine then a tower server with that same length. You have got that, and I've got it just below me here. I can't show you because it's on the floor and it's quite heavy, but you do have that width, so you need to make sure that you account for the need for additional storage. So before I go into the finer details, I wanted to exchange or share my experience of having my home server to which I've created my virtual environment on. Now it's been less than a year. It's been less than a year since I purchased my server for under $2,000. Before that, I had a desktop PC that I pretty much used for labbing, and this had, it was quite significant. I think it came with 32 gigs of RAM, and I built this machine myself as well, so it came with 32 gigs of RAM, a decent CPU, and some good storage. But it got to a point where it wasn't enough. And even with my physical lab, again, that was loud and using quite a lot of electricity, I needed a different option. So I started to look towards a virtual route. So my experience in a nutshell is, as it says there on the top of the slide, I love it, but my missus doesn't like the noise. And as I mentioned before, this is because my server is currently in the living room. So whenever she's watching television or anything like that, and my server starts to get loud, and that's because the fans are spinning and I'm using quite a lot of resources, so it needs to keep the system cool. It is loud. So my missus doesn't like that. So yeah, that's one of my experiences. The second one is quite interesting, and the reason I say it's interesting is because when I say you need to be prepared for long hours and additional learning, by this I mean not long hours actually learning within your virtual lab. I mean long hours learning on how to get your server set up and your environment ready for your virtual environment. So this will be things such as ESXi, which version do you use, which version is supported by the server that you've purchased. IP addressing, you need to take into consideration IP addressing for things like lights out management, and also your ESXi environment. There'll be things that you run into, especially if you're not too familiar with virtual environments. There'll be things that you run into like what virtual network adapter should I use, what virtual network adapter is supported. You'll be trying to marry up MAC addresses, interface virtual MAC addresses to to the virtual adapters at some points, and just things like this. So what I mean is you're going to spend quite a lot of time learning virtualization, and that's a good thing, especially you're in the technology space, so learning anything technical is a benefit to yourself. The next one was, I personally found it was a good investment to myself. So as I say, I paid just short of $2,000 or around $2,000 for my server after looking and kind of trying to understand the sort of specification that I wanted. And since I've had my server, I've learned a lot to do with virtualization. I've learned a lot in terms of technology. I've been studying for certifications, and I just have the ability just to spin up a new router or a new firewall and just start labbing. So for me, it's a good investment. And if you look at investment as in what you paid for that server to the certifications you gain, and off the back of that certification, what sort of salary you can look at or what sort of pay rise you have, you'll soon find that you'll probably make that money back in no time. So for me, it's a brilliant investment. And it's perfect for lab recreates and certification study, which I've already mentioned. For me, I come across a lot of different customer environments, a lot of different issues I'm faced with from time to time. And it's always great to say, let me just go away and lab that, instead of having to reach out to Cisco TAC, or whoever it may be, whichever technology it may be, or instead of trying to go online and try to find solutions to issues that have already been documented online. Of course, that's the easier way, but sometimes you really want to understand what the issue is and how it's been and how it occurred. So for me, it's always good to be able to do that lab recreation. And I mentioned it on the last slide, these things can be big, so ensure that you have the room. And remember, not everything can be labbed. So depending on what sort of technologies you're working on, depending on which vendor, you will realize that certain features or certain devices cannot be labbed. There's features such as I think MacSec, for instance. Last time I checked, that can't be labbed. There's things such as maybe 802.1x. There's certain things that cannot be labbed. So if you are thinking or considering buying a virtual lab environment and a server, please do make sure that you really understand what it is you're trying to achieve off the back of buying this server before you actually get it, and is the sort of technologies that you're working with suitable for virtual lab environments. If it is, then all well and good, off you go. But don't let that be a barrier, because you can also you can still have your virtual environment, and then maybe you've got physical hardware as well. So like myself, I've got physical hardware. What I can do is I can attach my virtual environment to my physical lab environment, and the things that I can't do virtually, I can do them physically, but also make use of features within my virtual environment. Bit of a mouthful, but yeah, you probably get where I'm going with that. So this is my server. I just wanted to give you guys an insight into what I'm working with, and it's always better to visualize this. And shout out to Intelligent Servers. This is a place in the UK where I actually purchased my server. So a bit of background about my server. After doing a lot of scouting online and really understanding what I wanted from a server in comparison to the cost that I was willing to pay, I found this server. Now this server was second hand, but technically brand new. So when I actually got this server, it was nearly brand new, or it looks brand new at least. All the parts, everything was brand new. And as you can see on the screen, I even get 3 years warranty, so that if any issues occur or arise, you know, I can contact the guys, intelligent servers, and then I can hopefully rectify or get those issues rectified. So my server is a HP ML350p generation 8, and it comes with two CPUs, so E5 267s. They're Intel Xeon processors. We'll look a little bit more there, so you can see the capacity here. I've got 46.3 gigahertz of CPU, which is more than enough. I can tell you that now for virtual labbing. You've got other things that you should take into consideration, such as fans, and more importantly for me, one important factor was RAM. So you need a lot of RAM to run a lot of different services. For me, RAM was important, and I wanted to go as far as I could in terms of getting as much RAM as I could for the price I was paying. So I managed to get 16 8 gig HP dual rank RAM sticks. So this gives me a total of 128 gigs of RAM. And let me tell you now, I run pretty beefy machines virtually, and I can run probably about close to 20 machines without any issues. And I mean, yeah, it just depends what you're running. So as I was saying that, Cisco Prime, for those that know, Cisco Prime uses, I think, 32 gigs of RAM by itself. So, you know, if you've got machines like that, obviously you need to take those into consideration in terms of how many different machines you can run simultaneously. But yeah, it's more than enough for a virtual environment. And that RAM and that space will go back down when you power off machines and you're not using machines or using different machines. I also got, I think it was 3 or 4 terabytes. Yeah, so 4 terabytes of storage. So SATA storage, and because of the RAID I have set up, I actually lose a terabyte of that, I think. So I ended up with about 3 terabytes of storage, which still is more than enough. And depending on how you set up your virtual software, will determine how that space is used, whether it's used as you go or whether you use it or you reserve that storage straight away. Another important factor is the power supplies that I got. So I got 2 power supplies built in, and I only use one actually, but you've got 2 power supplies for redundancy if you want them. And the brilliant thing with a few more things just to point out before I actually go on to that is I also needed to take into consideration a number of network interfaces that were available on these servers. And the reason I had to take that into consideration is because I wanted to integrate it with my home network so that I could access it remotely or from my home network. And I also wanted to join my virtual environment up to my physical lab environment. And I also wanted other spare slots for things like wireless environments, etc. So for me, I had to take that into consideration. As you can see on the towards the right hand side here, I have 5 NICs. One of them is actually a lights out, so integrated lights out management. So this is for management to the server itself. So if you take away that, you've got 4 ports, which is still sufficient for me. I've got a VGA port there on the back. I use that for setting up the server, and then that's it. I don't use it now because I've got integrated lights out management, so I just connect to the server with the IP address when I need to. Dual power supply, as you can see there on the bottom right hand side. There's two there. You don't have to power two. Powering two obviously means more electricity. This is more so for environments, so for office environments, or for environments where if one power supply died, you know, it's going to impact business. For a lab environment, you know, I think if one power supply died, it's not going to be such a big issue. Yes, you're going to probably, your stuff are going to be powered down, but you could just switch your cable and plug it into the next one and continue, and then get the first power supply fixed. So for me, I use only one power supply, conserves electricity, and although I get a little warning flashing light on the front of the server, it doesn't bother me because I know what that means. So you can do the same. So that's my server. My server cost £1,500. It was actually on eBay for, I think it was 1,750 or 1,800, so nearly £2,000, which is probably equivalent to probably $2,300 or so. But they also had the button, and the button that I love, where you can offer them a price, and if they accept it, then you've bought it. So I did that, and I paid £1,500 for this server, and I went and picked it up because I was so unimpatient and I couldn't wait to get it. I had to have that the same day. Well, not the same day actually. I had to go get it the next day because they built the server for me. So then I went and picked it up, and that was it. The rest is history. So this is what my virtual environment looks like, and some of you may be looking at that and thinking, what the hell? Everything you're looking at on screen is virtual, apart from the wireless connection. So this wireless is a separate wireless environment that I have that connects into a virtual environment. My virtual environment starts from this FTD, so from the firewall basically. And then I've got other things going on in here. I've got other ASAs, CSRs. I've got ASAs in high availability. I've got FTDs in high availability. I've got NAS servers. I've got Kali Linux source running. I've got zone-based firewalls running. I've got ICE, WSAs, virtual wireless LAN controllers, Splunk, Firepower Management Center, Cisco Prime, Active Directory servers, Cisco Directory Agent or Context Directory Agent, and all this is virtual, and it's just amazing. You know, you're looking at this and all that. If you thought about powering that physical equipment, it's going to cost you a lot of money. All this to me is virtual, so it's wonderful. I run it within the box. And what you can see here, you may have already noticed, I actually have what I was talking about before. So I actually have a virtual environment within my virtual environment. So I'm running EveMG. So this virtual environment is more of a lab environment that I can obviously tear down, change things, break things. But this is a more permanent fixture. If I wanted to create, small labs or labs that I'm just pretty much going to tear up, build up and tear down, or labs where I need to quickly recreate something, then I'm going to use EveMG, and I can run that within there as well. And the way I have it set up is I can actually remote access into my virtual environment and do whatever I need to do, even when I'm not at home. So it's really cool. I really love it, and I have access to absolutely anything that I want, or at least Cisco-wise. And this really helps me with whatever I need to do. So that's my virtual lab environment, and I just wanted to show you that because although it's changing, and you can see, let me just go back to that, and you can see empty sites here, this is because I can change stuff around, I can change adapters, I can change the way the network works. This is the wonderful thing about having a virtual lab environment. That's my environment. I do plan on discussing this a little bit more in maybe an upcoming video and how I've connected all the dots and got everything working. But for now, I just wanted to show you that, to show you what you can actually do once you purchase a server, the sort of virtual environment that you can create, all for under $2,000 or £1,500. So how do you get started? So I've talked and I've showed you what my virtual environment looks like, what my server looks like, benefits and drawbacks. Now you're probably wondering how you actually get started with creating your virtual lab or getting your server to create your virtual lab environment. So what I would say is, number one, and feel free to reference this checklist when you are looking at purchasing your own server to create your virtual environment. Decide if the benefits outweigh the negatives for investing in your own server. And I say this because if you're getting into IT but you're not really yet sure whether it's for you or not, then probably the negatives are going to outweigh the benefits, so you won't end up getting a server. If you are more serious, doing certifications, maybe already working in the industry, then the benefits are probably going to outweigh the negatives. So I would seriously do a pros and cons if you must, and decide whether investing in your own server is for you. Number two, decide what specification would be ideal for your environment, typically with hardware that is less than 10 years old. So I've put this in red because this is a really important factor. So I spoke about CPU, I spoke about storage, and I spoke about RAM. They're three important factors and three things you need to consider when looking at servers to purchase for your virtual environment. Everybody's needs are different, so although I decided my main focus was to get as much RAM as possible, yours might not be. Yours might be storage over RAM, or vice versa. Yours might be RAM as well. Make sure you understand what it is you're trying to achieve, and then based off of that, look at specifications you think would suit you. So the way I did it was I got a piece of paper and I drafted up a topology of devices that I would need for, let's say, the CCIE security exam. And based off of that, I then calculated how much RAM, potential storage, and CPU this would all use. And then I then come to a conclusion of what sort of resources I would need in order to build my environment. I also accounted for an additional space, if you like, and the reason being is so that I can build extra stuff and mess about with different stuff. I say typically less than 10 years old because technology is moving that fast. There's new CPUs coming out, storage is getting cheaper, RAM is getting cheaper depending on what sort of RAM you're looking at, whether it be DDR3 or DDR4. So I say less than 10 years old because you can still get up to around 10 years old, just less. You can still get some decent RAM, you can still get some decent storage, and you can still get some decent CPUs within that time frame that will serve you well for your environment. Obviously, the newer hardware or specifications you're looking at, the more costly it's going to be. So to keep it under that $2,000 price mark, I recommend you look at hardware that is less than 10 years old and not brand new. Number 3, scout the internet or local businesses for used servers. So as I said, used servers is the way to go. You're not going to get a brand new server with a decent spec for under $2,000, or I would be surprised if anybody comments on this video and tells me they did just that. So scout the internet. I did the same, so I had a look around eBay, Amazon. I even considered building my own, which worked out a lot more costly because you're buying the new hardware. So just scout the internet, see what's about, or look at local businesses that may be closing down or having a refresh of their servers and want to get rid of their old servers. If that's the route you go down, more than likely that company is not going to give you their storage, so their hard drives, because it'll have information on there, whether it's been deleted or not, that is probably going to be confidential. So you may find you still might be able to get a good server with RAM and CPU, but then you might have to go out and buy storage. And depending on the type of storage you're buying, so for mine it needs to be official HP storage. It's going to be quite expensive depending on the sort of storage that you're going to get. So just go out, have a look and see what's best for you. Number 4, once you've sourced a potential server, consider how you will fund a purchase. So as I said, $2,000 or less is still quite a significant amount of money to put down on a piece of hardware. So once you've found what you're looking for, maybe you have the money to go out and buy that straight away. That's all well and good. If you don't, then put a plan together of how you're going to save that money to purchase that hardware. And if it's going to take you a couple of months, you need to also then consider the quantity that the seller may have of these servers. You need to consider if there's any offers on that server at the moment, is that still going to be there by the time you've got the money? So you need to consider these sort of things if you're not putting down that money straight away. By all means, if you've got that money straight away, go out and just buy it. Number 5, if happy with the server you intend to buy, then make the purchase. So that's pretty much what I just said. Number 6, set time aside to build out your new virtual environment. So as I mentioned before, you're going to spend a lot of time messing with the virtualization elements before you actually start getting to your virtual lab and labbing within your virtual lab. So set some time aside. You know, it's not an overnight thing where you can just set it up and, you know, the next day you'll be running within your virtual environment. It may take you some time to get set up. Have a look into what ESXi version is supported for your hardware, and set some time aside to do things like create an IP address space for specific elements of that network. Number 7, download and install VMware ESXi. So ESXi I recommend for running. Download that, get that installed, and make sure you understand it before you proceed with installing new hardware onto the system. Number 8, spend time learning how ESXi works. So that's pretty much what I just said. You know, make sure you look into the working parts of ESXi before you get going. Don't try and run before you can walk, is what I will say, especially if you're not familiar with virtual environments. Number 9, download all virtual images that you wish to use. So whether this is Cisco images that you may have access to, or Palo Alto, Juniper, Checkpoint, whatever it is, make sure you get those downloaded so that they're ready to upload to your data store and install onto ESXi to get going with your virtual environment. And last but not least, number 10, read documentation and best practices before installing images. This is very important because when installing images, if it's a VM image, more than likely the settings are going to be there and working for you straight away. But if it's an image that you have to install and select the operating system, the underlying operating system, and things like that, it's always best to check what sort of virtual NICs are supported, what storage type needs to be used, how much CPU you need to allocate at minimum. Always check these things before you start building these devices, because if you don't, you're going to spend a lot of time trying to troubleshoot or rebuild because of issues you're facing within your virtual environment. Now, on to creating your virtual lab environment. So you've got your server, you've got ESXi installed, you've got all your images, you've read what you need to read about ESXi, and you're ready to go. So now we start to look at how you create your virtual lab environment. So number one, I would say plan out control plane subnets, data plane subnets, and management subnets. So what I mean by this is, if we just go back to my topology, you've got interfaces that may be using, you can see a couple of areas here that are using OSPF or EIGRP, whatever it may be. You've got links between devices that may only need to be a /30 or /29 subnet. So what I would say is, plan out these subnets, plan out if you're using out-of-band management, plan out those subnets, plan out the subnets you're going to use for virtual sites you create, and get those noted down because that's going to be important for maintaining and accessing different devices within your virtual environment. Number two, envisage a topology and design it, ideally future-proof. So by this, what I mean is pretty much what I've done. Start off with a base topology that's going to be there for the foreseeable future, where you can tear down and build it up. But more so if you have the edge of the network, which is never going to change, build a topology and make sure that is there available all the time to access your virtual environment. So just to give you an idea, we'll just go back to this topology again. So for instance, this firewall on the edge of the network or the edge of the virtual network isn't going to change. You've got other elements in here that might not change. It might be only like site 6 or site 5. You may decide to remove devices or change things around. That will change. So plan out a topology that A, works for you, but B, is also future-proof. Number 3, make a note of all configuration, things like IP addresses and device names, and even passwords if you must. The reason I say this is because depending on how far you go with your virtual lab environment, you'll be using a lot of different IP addresses. Things will be changing quite a lot, and it gets frustrating when you can't remember IP addresses or devices, usernames and passwords and stuff. So it's a lab environment, things change, so I would always recommend making a note of all the configuration that you create. Number 4, deploy top to bottom. Will the virtual lab connect to your network? And by this I mean deploy top to bottom. If you're connecting to your home network, then the top element will be anything that's on the edge of your virtual environment going into your virtual environment. So as you saw on mine, it was the FTD device. Yours may be different, so make sure you deploy top to bottom rather than bottom up. I would recommend. And if your virtual environment connects to your home network, you also need to make sure you plan a ideally static IP address connecting to your virtual lab environment, and you also need to make sure that you plan for any additional cables that might be required to reach your home router or whatever device you've got in place. Number 5, ensure that sufficient resources are given to each virtual machine. I can't stress this enough, I've already mentioned it before. Make sure you read the documentation before you're spinning up images to understand what the minimum resource requirement is before you actually go ahead with trying to spin up that new device. Number 6, test connectivity as you go. As you're building your lab, you'll want to make sure you've got connectivity to all the bits and pieces. So make sure you keep testing as you go, whether that be SSH access or ICMP. Number 7 is more an optional part. You can configure, depending on what you've got in your environment, you can configure remote access to your virtual environment so that when you're not at home and you're at work or off-site, you can access your environment to maybe do a lab recreate or just check something that you was working on. This is always good in my opinion to have it in place. Number 8, once the topology is fully deployed, test end-to-end connectivity. So what you don't want to do is put all these lovely bits and pieces in your virtual environment, not have tested connectivity, and then you try and reach the outside world from inside your virtual environment and it doesn't work. You'll spend a lot of time troubleshooting and you won't know what device is at fault or what devices are at fault until you do troubleshoot. So it's always best to follow step number 6, and once you've fully deployed everything, make sure you test that connectivity again. Number 9, export all device configs. These will become your golden template. So once you have a base topology in place, especially if you're following my method, if this is your base topology, let's say, and then you were using your Eve or GNS environment or whatever it may be to build up and tear down networks, then all your virtual environment is pretty much going to stay the same. So what I would do, once all the configuration is in place, export all the device configurations so that you have these, and if anything changes or anything breaks, you can just recreate that with the configurations you have by spinning up another device and following the same process. And number 10, once you've done that, then you should be pretty much ready to go to start labbing. You've got your new virtual lab environment set up and ready to go, so you should be pretty much there. So I hope this has been useful for you. I've tried to give you as much information and experience based on the things that I've done and been through. If you have any more questions, feel free to drop me a line on my YouTube channel or on my blog, and I will get back to you. As I said before, I do plan on doing a video, a more technical related video on my lab environment and how it's configured and how it's set up, so that you can follow that as a template if you wish. But until then, make sure you are subscribed. Please share this video if you found it useful. Drop me a like and turn on those notifications. Thank you.